Welcome, Patty Weston.
Thank you very, very much. So I'm very happy to be here for many reasons. One of the reasons is when I was doing my initial work on Timbuctoo, I worked at the American Friends Service Committee. So I learned about Quaker values and the importance of the inherent good in every person, and this emphasis on what other Christians call the golden rule, which is really manifested in everything that Quakers do. So when you think about Quakers being leaders in ending slavery, and you come forward and you see social justice work, anti-war work, peace work, work to basically help others live as well as you do. It shouldn't be that I'm here and you're there. It shouldn't be that we have injustice. And I was just impressed with the emphasis on helping other people as a lesson that we can all learn. So then when you talk about what Quakers' motivations were in being in the anti-slavery movement, I think of all those things that Quakers do today, and it doesn't come as a surprise to me. So my opening questions, I've got to figure out where I'm going to, I hate to have my back to people, but no matter where I stand, I'm going to have my back to somebody. Maybe I'll start here. So the first sellers of land to black people in 1826 in Timbuctoo were Quakers who were members of Rancocas Monthly Meeting and Mount Holly Monthly Meeting. I am most struck, for example, by the fact that if this building is from 1777 or 6 or 5, wherever it was, that the very people who sold land to us in Timbuctoo came to meeting for worship here, stood on this same floor. I don't know how old the benches are. Maybe they sat in the same benches. I don't know. They certainly kneeled on the same floor. And that is very significant to me. Timbuctoo provides tangible examples of Quaker participation in black settlements. Quakers were leaders in petitioning the New Jersey legislature to end slavery. Quakers made southern New Jersey a fertile ground for black settlements long before the Civil War. And of course, I want to start, as I normally do, by telling you why I have a personal stake in this history. I talked about fertile ground for black settlements. When you look at the black settlements, most of them are in the southern part of the state, and most of them are near Quaker strongholds where Quakers were influential. Timbuctoo was near Mount Holly, for example. But to go back to my passion and my personal stake and my motivation, I go to my cousin Lillian, who was my grandmother's first cousin, who was a very special person to me, who happened to be the person in our family that had our Timbuctoo land before we did. So one day we went to Lillian's house, and she said she wanted to give us the family property. My mother knew more about that than I did, perhaps, but none of us knew that when she gave us the family property, she would hand us an envelope with 20 or 25 pages of documents. We expected typewritten modern documents. We got, let's go back, 20 or 25 pages of that. And so what struck me the most is, at the time I was probably 25 years old, my mother might have been 45, and we had never seen these. Nobody had ever told us they existed. They weren't a big deal. They were just family papers like anybody would have. We didn't know that the history went back that far. So this is the original deed. The diagonal line on the right side is what was called the Turnpike Road from Rancocas to Mount Holly. Turnpike Road. Today it's just Rancocas Road, 2A, but it was a very big deal in its day. And then the plot of land is in the middle, and then you have the cover and part of the description of the deed. We also got my fourth great-grandfather's last will and testament. So my fourth great-grandfather purchased 1 acre and then 1/4 acre of land from a Quaker farmer whose name was Samuel Atkinson, who belonged to this meeting. We also got his last will and testament. That was 1829. Fast forward 13 years to 1842. He must have been in ill health because he died the next year, and he did have the foresight to have a last will and testament, which is quite a feat for anybody at that time, except for the most educated and sophisticated of people. And I won't read you the whole thing, obviously, but the very fact that we have the original document tells us another narrative about our history. And because I had his last will and testament, I could go to the county surrogate's office and get a copy of the inventory of his estate. So, excuse me. So I know how many cows and pigs he had, and his pieces of furniture, his clothes, and some details of property that wouldn't even be enumerated in a will of today. So we know he had an estate worth $108, which is much more than, which was a lot more money then than it is now. And one of the most interesting documents was an indenture of mortgage dated October 22nd, 1845, when my fourth great grandfather had died in 1843. 2 years later, his wife and son-in-law and daughter-in-law needed money. So they took out a mortgage for $155 from a Quaker businessman by the name of William Hilliard, who was a member of Rancoca's monthly meeting. They paid it back in installments between $1.50 and $7 a year. The receipts are written on the back of the indenture of mortgage, which is what you're looking at here. So it'll say received of such and such a family member so many dollars for the payment for a particular year. But then for 1875 and 1876, it says received of John Giles 2,000 bricks at $12 a thousand to pay the interest on the within bond for 1875 and 1876. So I envision John Giles driving up to the Hilliard house in a wagon full of bricks and people offloading the bricks. It turns out that what is now Tarnsfield, or part of what is now Tarnsfield, was a brickyard, and a lot of the people who lived in Timbuctoo worked in the brickyard. So my third great-grandfather had died the year before, and so his sons had to go to work and make 2,000 bricks, and when those bricks were made, the mortgage was paid for 1875 and 1876. So from these documents, I began to get images of my family history that most people can never have. And I haven't studied this closely, but I do know that my second great-grandfather didn't pay that mortgage off until 1896, which is 54 years. So I don't know what the financial circumstances were, but the point is they were allowed to take that long based on their need. And if I didn't have ancestors with that foresight, I wouldn't be here now. I'd be somewhere else. So I am thankful for that story. And I was in fact surprised. I was shocked because one of the things we have done in the Timbuctoo Historical Society is to develop a curriculum project so that people who attend local schools can learn the history of Timbuctoo. I have a neighbor who's great, he's 89. His great-great-grandfather came to Timbuctoo in 1850, and he didn't know until I told him. But how many of you know who your 1850 relative was and where they lived? Probably nobody. So on the one hand, that's not a surprise. On the other hand, it's sad that people don't know their history and that the history wasn't even taught in schools. So with funding from the Burlington County Parks Department, we work with teachers from Rancocas Valley High School and West Hampton Middle School to develop materials so people could learn the history of Timbuctoo, not as a separate thing, but integrated into the teaching of history when you're teaching that period of time. This is a map of, I'm going to go ahead and skip past that. This is a summary of Timbuctoo, which was settled in 1826. It was a stop on the Underground Railroad. That last map was a map of Underground Railroad sites or stations or places in New Jersey. So there were many. Timbuctoo was not by itself. And different sites had different roles in the Underground Railroad. But the point is that the Underground Railroad went through this area, and Timbuctoo was one of many places that was involved in the Underground Railroad. And one thing that strikes people is that Timbuctoo residents owned their land for the most part. They established schools and churches and sometimes read about themselves in the local paper. When we talk about specific connections to Quakers, we see that we know William Hilliard was a 48-year-old Quaker farmer. His wife was Hannah Rowland. He sold his first 4 acres in September of 1826. In fact, the 3rd of September and the 23rd of September were the dates of those sales. So every September, we celebrate what we call Timbuctoo Day, and that is actually next Saturday. So we hope that people can see the information on our table back there and that some of you can attend. He was a member of Rancocas monthly meeting. He owned brickyards, as I said before, and he provided my family with a mortgage of $155 to help us when we needed it. Then we have Samuel Atkinson. This was the man who sold us our 2 parcels. He was the husband of Hannah Grubb. He sold about 5 acres between 1829 and 1831. He was associated with this meeting and the Rancocas meeting, and he sold a parcel to my family, 2 parcels actually, in 1829 and 1831. And then we have Abigail Bone Haywood, which is one of the most interesting and intriguing stories in my view. Her husband was named George Haywood. He sympathized with Southern enslavers, frequently ruled on their behalf. So she was a Quaker woman, grew up in a Quaker family, a prominent Quaker family. He was born in Virginia, so they grew up with different attitudes about black people. So what happened, not necessarily in sequence, a case comes before George Haywood. He rules for that person to go back to Virginia or Maryland where they were enslaved. She turns around, she sells land to black people to help them. And the funny thing about that, obviously, is that would cause tension in any marriage today. Imagine the woman having the gall to obviously upset her husband and do things exactly the opposite of what he would like to be done. But then when you look at the 1860 census, it reports that her estate was worth $20,000, while his was worth only $2,000. So she had the money in the family. Those sound like small amounts of money, but that was a lot of money then, and she had 10 times as much money as her husband did. So she was able to be much more assertive than many women would be. You can't see her gravestone very well. It's in the Mount Holly. Is that Mount Holly Cemetery? No, it's not Mount. Which cemetery is Abigail Haywood buried in? It is, I believe it's the, it's not the Mount Holly Cemetery, I can't remember. But anyway, that stone is still there, but that's a recent picture. And it has her name as Abigail Bone, wife of George Haywood. So he's acknowledged, but his name is not there. What woman in 1860, whenever she died, would dare put her name without his? Say that louder so people can hear it.
She was in charge.
Right, she was in charge. So we talked about the first sellers. The first buyers are David Parker, Ezekiel Parker, Waldell Parker, and Hezekiah Hall. And the 5th buyer was John Brewer, the most important one, of course, because he was my ancestor. And again, without him, I wouldn't be here. And so this map basically shows the first 20 years or so of land sales. I don't know how many people are familiar with the fact that the county clerk's office has deeds going back to at least the late 1700s. They're these huge books. I never thought about it. So if you did a land sale in those days, somebody wrote out a deed and the party signed it. And then when you went to register at the clerk's office, somebody had to write out another copy. Well, most of us don't have our copies, but the county clerk's office still has all those copies. And the National Park Service did a transcription of most of those deeds for several decades. And then we have people like Paul Schopp, who is behind me, and Damon Terrianis, who did further research that allows us to make maps like this one and to know things about our history that we wouldn't. You think about David Parker, Ezekiel Parker, Waldell Parker, and Hezekiah Hall. So David Parker shows up with $15.40 cash. Where did he get it? Who knows? I think that things were very different then in terms of people built their own houses and were able to buy things with cash in ways that they can't today. But the fact of the matter is all these men were formerly enslaved. We know that Hezekiah Hall came to this area in probably 1822 or 3. no, excuse me, 1813 or 1415, 12 years before, I'm not doing the math right, I'm tired. But he had been here for at least a decade before he bought this property. And he had been enslaved in Maryland before, but somehow or another, these people worked and saved their money and had money to buy land with, and in some cases, their ancestors are still here, their descendants are still here, rather. David Parker had maybe 10 grandchildren that were born in the 1920s in Mount Holly, and most of them have descendants that still live here. One of his great-great-grandchildren lives in West Hampton still, but many of them still live in the area. So they obviously have a very strong affinity. And then, of course, John Brewer was my ancestor, and we are still here. One thing I did not do was look at my watch when I started. So somebody tell me how much time I have left. Who's in charge? Anybody in charge? My Quakers don't believe in hierarchy. What's that?
You officially have 15 more minutes.
Oh, good. Well, I think I could finish 15 minutes. That's true. So where I wanted to go from here is to talk about the fact that free black people before the Civil War were not as unique or original as we think, because this is a map of the early colonies and states. I guess at this point they're not colonies anymore, obviously, but the point is that there are two things that you can see here. One is the places with the darkest colors are the places with the highest proportion of free black people, and you notice that all the northern states, particularly the original ones, all had, in 1830, 3 decades before the Civil War, more than 90% of black people in each one of these places were free, as compared to the southern states that didn't have nearly as many. So one big missing piece from our study of history is people don't have a sense of the extent of free black people, and therefore we have different attitudes about what life must have been like for those people. There was a gradual manumission law passed by the New Jersey legislature in 1804, which required registration of birth of children of enslaved people born on and after July 4th, 1804. And the reason for the registration was to track how many years women were free, men were free. My brain is gone, I'll have to read it here. 25 years for males and 21 years for females. So in order to be able to track that time, you had to know when they were born and register people. So that was a compromise that obviously everyone didn't like, but we'll get into the details of that a little later. The point I wanted to make, though, was that it wasn't all cozy and comfortable, because there's one author, Jan Gigantino, who recounts cases of black people being sold as slaves after their indentures were up. So you're born on July 5th, 1804, which means in 1829, on July 5th, you should be free from your obligation of indentured servitude to your mother's master, but instead, somebody a year earlier takes you to Alabama and sells you as a slave. So it wasn't always good, but there's a whole lot of good that we don't know about. This is an illustration of the difference in enslaved people by geographic region. And again, the fact, in this case, the darkest colors are the ones in the southern region of the state, and the lighter colors, for the most part, are in the northern region of the state. I hope I don't have to ask, you can tell me if you know the answer. Why is there such a stark difference between North Jersey and South Jersey? East Jersey, West Jersey, you're correct. Agriculture is one thing. Quakers! If no one knew that anywhere else, they should know it here. It's oversimplified to say that the only reason is Quakers, but the fact of the matter is Quakers were very influential. They were a substantial part of the population, and they lived much more in South Jersey than they did in North Jersey. But agriculture is an issue, I would say. The economies of the northern counties relied more on black people for labor in agriculture. and the fact that the northern counties were settled by the Dutch, who had a system that incentivized them to keep enslaved people. This looks at that over time. Again, even social studies teachers that I talk to are surprised to know that in 1790, right after or soon after the Revolutionary War, only 11% of black people in the northern counties were free, but in the southern counties, nearly 2/3 were free. So long before the Gradual Manumission Act, there were stark differences in slavery between the northern counties and the southern counties. So we all know that many Quakers were in slavery before 1776, that they had a long and passionate debate that slavery was wrong because it was incompatible with the Golden Rule, and that liberty was the birthright of black people as well as white people. One thing that I haven't had a chance to look into, if this statistic says that Quakers comprise 1/6 of the statewide population during the Revolutionary War period, given the difference in concentration, it was 1/6 overall. It might have been 1/3 or some larger number in the southern counties. It was really much more concentrated in the south than the north. They were very influential in culture and politics. And of course, everyone in this room knows who John Woolman was and that he was from Mount Holly. He was arguably one of the most influential Quaker abolitionists of the era. He was influential throughout Quaker communities, not just here. He's born in Quakers. There is a home I can't see it anymore, I thought it was gone, but there used to be a very visible home right as you enter 295 going southbound from Rancocas Road. That was a Woolman family home. But I'm going to turn to my friend again, Paul.
That's Uriah Woolman's house. The Woolman property was wiped out when they built 295.
Really? I don't know how many times I've heard what I just told you, so I'm glad you were here for me to turn around and so repeat that again so I can get it right.
Yeah, all of Woolman's property where he was born was wiped out when they built 295.
So that house that was there is what?
That's Uriah Woolman's house. It's here by the
Okay,
family.
thank you. I'll modify all my slides. Woolman published numerous essays, especially against slavery. His journal was published after he died, and it was called the Journal of John Woolman. Lots of interesting stuff there. This just talks about how he was influential in movements to end slavery, and including a rule that forbade Quakers to buy or sell slaves after 1758. And then in 1776, New Jersey and Pennsylvania Friends prohibited members from owning slaves. Some people left the society because they couldn't stay if they kept slaves. As we said before, Quakers were leaders in advocacy to end slavery in New Jersey, petitioning the legislature in 1785, and doing advocacy over almost 2 decades. Gradually, after 19 years, we got the 1804 law that I talked about before, which required people to serve a period of indentured servitude to their mothers enslavers. So what's wrong with that picture? Right. Well, they were indentured servants. Like, there may not be a lot of difference. I guess the point I would make here, as bad as that was, the reality was that the pro-slavery faction in the legislature would not agree to anything else but this. So it was this or nothing. Certainly in today's politics, which I won't get into, we don't like compromises that hurt people. But this is what they did, and this is what ended up being true. Another interesting thing to me that I didn't know until recently was that if you want to measure or quantify the influence or the behavior of Quakers toward enslaved people, it's interesting to note that by 1800, the residents of Burlington, Gloucester, and Salem counties, and Gloucester included, Camden County didn't exist yet in 1800. So what is now Camden County was part of Gloucester and maybe part of Burlington too, but certainly Camden County is not represented here because it didn't exist. But the point is, the residents of those counties owned only 3% of black people held as slaves, even though they're 23% of the population. So that in itself, that there was a difference in quantified terms. Quakers were so influential in this region in the 19th century that 19th century historian Henry Schofield Cooley called these the three great Quaker counties. Last question about Quakers and slavery. Did Quakers manumit their slaves because they thought they wouldn't go to heaven when they died if they kept enslaved people? Or did Quakers manumit their enslaved people because they had empathy towards black people? I don't expect anybody to answer those questions. But what we know, so I don't draw conclusions if I don't have enough information, but again, a concrete thing that we know was that while other religious movements called for ending slavery, Quakers had a organization-wide or a throughout the community of Quakerdom in the United States, you had to manumit your slaves or you had to leave the society. It might be true that Methodists, some factions of Methodist churches were anti-slavery too, but there was no case where you couldn't be a Methodist anymore if you kept slaves. So Quakers are distinguished in this regard. Other Christian groups involved in abolition, as I said, were typically the nonconformist factions of those denominations without the influence to compel everybody to behave. We have to point out, though, that there are certainly many cases, this is just one, that everything wasn't nice the way it was supposed to be, because William Bone was born enslaved in 1735. His enslaver took him to meeting for worship every week, or frequently. He was so impressed that when he was manumitted, he said he wanted to become a member of the Society of Friends, but he was denied over and over and over and over and over again until 1814, when he was 79 years old, he was finally admitted to the Society of Friends. So the fact that Quakers were advocates against slavery, in this concrete case, didn't mean that they wanted black people to be together with them. I have a friend, a white friend, who says, yeah, the Quakers did all the things for your family, but did they invite you to dinner? And I don't know the answer to that question, but when you contrast the behavior of Quakers with the behaviors of enslavers in the South, there's a very clear contrast. Tangible outcomes of Quaker involvement with abolition and resettlement of black people include land sales, employment, mortgages, and I've got examples of all of those in my documents, assistance to escapees, and community development. This is, let's go back. I keep pushing. This is a picture of the Timbuctoo cemetery. I wanted you to see what Timbuctoo looks like today. We say the cemetery is the only above ground evidence of Timbuctoo's history. The Timbuctoo Historical Society obtained title to the cemetery in 2021. And so we are working to preserve the cemetery in terms of, one thing is simply having signage, and we have 2 more signs besides these. One thing is preserving the gravestones. One thing is ensuring the integrity of the property. One thing is getting Timbuctoo listed on the New Jersey and National Register of Historic Places. We're already listed on the New Jersey Black Heritage Trail, as well as the Underground Railroad Network to Freedom. I probably should not show this picture. This is an incomplete sign that's in fabrication. As of yesterday, it had gotten to the point of being finished to this degree, but it still has to be painted. And we're hoping that it arrives here next Friday so we can have it for our celebration on Saturday. But it points out that Timbuctoo was established in 1826 and identified the first 5 landowners. After I had written this text, when you apply to this program, which is a very rigorous 10-page paper with 3 primary and 3 secondary sources as you're still in graduate school. And so you go back and forth with the language and the text, and they say, well, you didn't include any women. And the reality is that there aren't that many examples of women in documents. You might have a document that says John Smith and his wife Susan sold a piece of property, but otherwise we didn't have a whole lot of examples of women, except for the fact that David Parker's second wife was Matilda Parker, and she was in a leadership role. She owned land in her own name, and she was a board member of the Beneficial Society of United Sons and Daughters of Timbuctoo and the city. And so it talks about those things. It talks about the fact that we established the African Union School in 1834. And I have one more slide in case I'm over time. We established the African Union School in 1834, which is very interesting because in those days, incorporation of schools and charitable organizations was relatively new. So the information that would go in articles of incorporation was in deeds. So this deed, and I should have put a copy of it here, it talked about the importance that a particular couple in Timbuctoo had land. They recognized that black people needed to learn, so they sold the land so the school could be built. In much more flowery language than I just said, but one thing that's very interesting, it said, in order to be a member of the board of directors, you had to be a person of color that lived within 10 miles of the premises. Lots of interesting stuff there. I didn't know we called ourselves people of color in 1834. Apparently that's not, I thought that was a term that someone like Jesse Jackson coined in 1980 something. I didn't know that we called ourselves people of color in the early 1800s. I certainly didn't know that a black institution could include that restrictive language in a deed and file it with the county clerk. But that happened. That speaks to the attitudes of the larger community. I have to acknowledge that school burned down 8 years or so later by detractors, but it was built back up. The fact of the matter is there had to be some segment of the population that agreed with black people being able to do things for themselves. Otherwise, documents like that could not be filed. So I have come to the end. This is my name, my website, our website, I should say. And that if anyone is interested in the statistics about Quakers that I cited, they're included in this article, which you can find online in a Google search. Thank you. I live in Washington, D.C., and I got on a 5:15 train to be here. So I'm happy that it all worked out. Because I was a little... Do we have any questions? I guess we can take just a couple before we go. Yes.
So the indentured contracts, are those filed with the county clerk? Do they live with the individual? I'm just curious about.
I would say they're filed in the county clerk's office. You can search them now. Is that correct? The indentured contracts. The indentured servitude. Where are those papers?
Indentured servants were usually a private contract between the lender and the indentured servant.
And so they weren't filed?
No.
Okay. Let's have Paul here. Yes.
What was the name of the city in mind?
Oh!
West Africa.
I must put that in every presentation because I try to be concise and that question always comes up. So we have researched that question and whether or not I should repeat the question. Why is there a Timbuctoo, New Jersey? Why did people in New Jersey, black people, name their community Timbuctoo? There are also black people in New York, in the Adirondacks, there's a Timbuctoo, New York. We had a global Timbuctoo symposium at Rutgers in 2017, which brought together people from Timbuktu, Mali, and Timbuktu, New Jersey, and Timbuktu, New York. There's also a Timbuktu in Jamaica, I'm told. But anyway, the thinking, well, there are a couple of things that are clear. It's not because the people in Timbuktu were from Mali. People in those days probably didn't know where they were from if their ancestors had been captured decades earlier. The notion of Timbuktu in African culture is one of prosperity and one of success and achievement. For example, the first university on the continent of Africa was in Timbuktu. If you look at ancient manuscripts from the 15th and 16th century, the 15 and 1600s. That's you see recipes for toothpaste, mathematical calculations, things about astronomy. So very clearly, they were very educated people. They were very successful people. There were people who were able to be active in their self-determination. And there's a quote which I had, which essentially says that it was only when the ugly hand of a slaveholder came to Mali that things got bad, that before that they were good. The point is that Timbuctoo in African culture means greatness and prosperity. There's another school of thought that says white people named Timbuctoo as a distant and otherly place, because even though you give that explanation that I just gave, everybody's reference to Timbuctoo, like our archaeologist said, his mother said she's going to send him to Timbuctoo if he didn't clean his room. Or Timbuctoo is always otherly, Timbuctoo is always different. There were stories of explorers in the early decades of the 20th century going to Timbuctoo and never coming home because they were captured or beat up or murdered. So those are the two schools of thought first, but there's no definitive conclusion. One thing that we're able to research, though, which I should point out, is that you can use sources like newspapers.com, take 1820 to 1840, search Timbuctoo, what do you see? And you see both of what I just said. So it happens both ways, and those create, there's a mechanism to study it. The point is, because you can know what somebody in 1825 would know about Timbuctoo based on what newspapers said. So those are the two potential reasons why the name was used. But certainly people who, and there's a much longer story to that that's also in an article on our website, but certain people don't realize, for example, that there were newspapers like the Philadelphia Inquirer and like the New Jersey Mirror, actually, that had stories about Timbuctoo, the other Timbuctoo. So it's not like they couldn't have known. Any other? I'll take two more questions. Ken.
If this had been last year, this gathering and this presentation would have been viewed differently than it is today.
And that is
Because the current administration of Washington trying to literally whitewash everything and get rid of the history they don't like. We need to oppose that today as strongly as they opposed slavery in the days in which people were still enslaved.
That is a very good point. Does everybody know Reverend Ken Pipes? Yes, ma'am.
We know about enslaved blacks. Was there ever a time that black folks migrated from other areas of the world and that were never enslaved?
Say that again.
We know a lot about enslaved blacks in America and other places. Was there ever a time that blacks from other continents or other places migrated to the United States who were never enslaved?
Well, there are, I can't answer that question specifically, but what I can say, for example, what people don't realize is that if 2/3 of black people in southern New Jersey were free in 1790, certainly people born in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s and 50s who descended from them could go back decades without any history of enslavement. So one thing that's funny to me, when I was explaining this to a reporter from the Inquirer once, she couldn't, and this happens a lot, get it in her head that there were black people that weren't enslaved, because that's all we learn about. So I can never say, but another thing I can say, I have a friend who's from Virginia, whose ancestors are in Virginia, and he, in 2022, was able to trace his ancestry back to 1619 through lineages of many, many generations without any slaves in the line. So there are examples, but I can't answer that definitively. I don't want to go over time. We'll take two more questions, Jamel. I'll take one more question, and I think we have to finish. Yes. Well, you're pointing. Go ahead.
I just have a quick point of fact. On the slide about the 3 counties where there were substantial Quakers and so on, when it says Gloucester County, at the time, that included all the way up to Camden County. And so that included, for example, Haddon Hill Friends Meeting and Newton.
Oh! And Atlantic County. And Atlantic County. ahead.
I just want to know where the cemetery is that you're going to ship to your
That is-
sign, where your sign is.
You mean the sign you saw in the picture, or the sign's going up next week?
It's,
The new sign.
the sign that's on the Quakers Road.
Oh, right down that street, about a block on the right side. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Time for lunch. Yes.